requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards. Our objectives this afternoon are to provide an overall understanding of the purpose of the uniform administrative requirements. We also want to focus on and understand those sections applicable to LIHEAP. And we want to provide guidance and suggestions to you on compliance with those sections of the Uniform Compliance Guidelines applicable to LIHEAP. The agenda for today, we'll do a brief overview of the circular, which will cover the pre-award requirements, the post-award requirements, the provisions of the single audit, and then we'll be opening to questions and answers. Next slide. The Department of Health and Human Services formally adopted the new OMB requirements on December 19, 2014, and they are incorporated in Title 45 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 75, as referenced on your slide. The purpose of the reform, or the OMB guidance, I'll wait till the next slide comes up, is intended to improve the integrity of the financial management and operation of federal programs and strengthen accountability for federal dollars by improving policies that protect against waste, fraud, and abuse. It is also intended to increase the impact and accessibility of programs by minimizing the time spent complying with unnecessarily burdensome administrative requirements, and so reorients recipients towards achieving program objectives. The purposes for the reform of the Uniform Administrative Guidance are listed in detail on this slide. I won't read them all off to you, but just wanted to make a point of a couple of the bullet points here. Again, it's to increase management focus on performance outcomes. The focus and the objective of the Uniform Administrative Requirements are to focus our performance on the outcomes, focus how we perform in relation to the grant, to the federal award. Also, grants are going to be awarded or to be awarded based on merit. That's another bullet point there. But didn't want to read each one of these bullet points, but just bring to your attention those two specifically. The next slide. The reform guidelines streamlined the language from 8 existing OMB circulars into one consolidated set of guidance in the Code of Federal Regulations. It is aimed at eliminating duplicate language in order to clarify policy. Hence, you've heard the term super or omni circular. Again, each one of these OMB circulars are now combined into one document. A little bit about the organization of the circular. The Uniform Administrative Requirements are organized into subparts, the same as in OMB guidance of Part 200. And it is important that you understand or know the organization of the Uniform Administrative Requirements, because this can assist you in finding answers on compliance issues. Subpart A is the acronyms and definitions. The general provisions are contained in Subpart B. Subpart C, the pre-federal award requirements and contents of the federal awards. Subpart D, the post-federal award requirements. Subpart E contains the cost principles, and Subpart F are the audit requirements. The appendices are organized also as in the OMB circular, which have been adopted into by HHS. I won't read each one of these appendices, but after the subparts, each appendices is labeled for additional information. The general provisions of Subpart B, Section 75.100, the general provisions, establish the purpose for the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements. Federal awarding agencies must not impose additional or inconsistent requirements unless specifically required by federal statute, regulation, or executive order. Again, this is consistent with the objective of minimizing the time spent complying with unnecessarily burdensome administrative requirements. Section 75.101, Subpart B of the general provision, states that the uniform administrative requirements are generally applicable to federal agencies and to all costs related to federal awards. This means that non-federal entities must comply with the requirements, regardless of whether the non-federal entity is a recipient or a subrecipient of a federal award. Section 75.101, subsection B, paragraph 3 further states that the audit requirements of the guidelines under Subpart F, which is required by the Single Audit Act, in any circumstances where the provisions of the federal statutes or regulations differ from the provisions of this part, the provision of the federal statutes or regulations govern. The Single Audit Act is law and is applicable to LIHEAP. There are exceptions to certain provisions of the Uniform Compliance Guidelines listed under paragraph D of the general provisions. It states that LIHEAP is applicable for sections 75.202 and 75.351 through 75.353. This webinar, again, will only focus on those provisions. Except for 75.202, I'm just reiterating this for emphasis, the requirement to provide public notice for federal financial assistance programs, and 75.353 subrecipient and contractor determinations through 75.351 subrecipient and contractor determinations through 75.353 fixed awards, subawards of Subpart D post-federal award requirements. The requirements in Subpart C, pre-federal award requirements and contents of federal awards, and Subpart D, post-federal award requirements, and Subpart E, cost principles do not apply to LIHEAP. And remember, Subpart F, the single audit requirements, is law, and LIHEAP is subject to those requirements. Now, to cover the recently issued LIHEAP information memorandum is Lauren Christopher, who's on the line. Lauren?
We appreciate you participating today. As you may recall, we had originally planned to hold this webinar earlier in the spring, but we wanted to make sure that we coordinated with all of our partners at the federal level to ensure we fully understood the impact of the new streamlined guidance from OMB on LIHEAP before we issued our final guidance to all of you. We did have some discussions about this at our National Grantee Training meeting in Baltimore in June, and it was very good to see most of you there. So as you may have seen, we emailed and posted to our main LIHEAP website on June 24th an information memorandum, which is basically a written policy statement from our office about anything that is impacting the federal expectations for how you administer your LIHEAPs locally. And so this particular IM, LIHEAP IM 2015-04, was regarding this new Uniform Administrative Guidance and what was specifically relevant for LIHEAP. And so as Charles has outlined, it does not entirely impact LIHEAP. Some of it will be very familiar to you in terms of what used to be referred to as the A133 requirements relating to audit requirements. And there are some tweaks to that in terms of the total amount of federal funding that you will get for that, which you'll be hearing about. And so just be aware that depending on the type of grantee you are, if you are a tribal grantee and you receive a smaller amount of federal funding total, this may or may not have a great impact on your LIHEAP. So most of this will impact state grantees and some of our larger funded tribal grantees. And so in that IM, we analyzed when this should really take effect for LIHEAP, for one thing. With the uniform guidance really kicking off in December, we realized that was already after the start of the 2015 federal fiscal year. This was after many of you had already issued your contracts and agreements for the year, and we did not want to negatively impact those processes you already had in place for this year and have to have you go back and make modifications. We also determined that although we issue typically more than one grant award to you each year, that really any subsequent grant award letters that we issue after the initial one is really considered an incremental award to your initial award. And for 2015, the first award was made to those grantees that had submitted complete plans to us, in which we had reviewed and considered met the congressional reporting requirements, were funded on October 15, 2014. We then issued additional grant award letters to tribes and other grantees as those plan submissions were completed. There was a second round of funding that was issued on January 21st, 2015, and a third round of funding issued on June 4th, 2015. We also anticipate issuing a small amount of reallotment funds from funds that were not obligated in 2014 by a few grantees. We hope that those awards will be going out in the next few weeks. And so we consider all of those awards to be incremental to the initial awards that were made in the fall of 2014. And therefore, as we communicated in this IM, we consider all of these to be part of that award, and we will not have the Uniform Administrative Guidance impact those awards for this year. We will actually be implementing it for federal fiscal year 2016. Next slide. And so for 2016, all of the requirements that are relevant for LIHEAP will take effect with all of your awards that you receive in 2016. You should disregard the footnote that was on the January 21st, 2015 award letter. That footnote had indicated that the Uniform Guidance was taking effect for LIHEAP, and we have confirmed internally that that would not be the case. We are not reissuing those grant award letters, but we, through this IM, communicated to all of you that you should disregard that footnote. Hopefully that should be sufficient for any questions or concerns that your independent auditors may raise on this issue. If you run into any complications on that, please feel free to reach out to your liaison with our office, and their contact information is on our main LIHEAP website. And as Charles has noted, and where he's going to pick up again, is walking you through the specific provisions that apply to LIHEAP and any changes to the provisions that had previously been in separate OMB guidance circulars. Many of you may be familiar with the OMB cost principles, which were part of what got streamlined into the Uniform Administrative Guidance. The cost principles have never applied to LIHEAP, and they continue not to be applied to LIHEAP. So I'm going to turn it back to Charles at this point to walk us through the specific provisions that will actually impact you for LIHEAP. Thanks.
Thank you, Lauren. We'll start with Subpart C, the pre-federal award requirements. Section 75.202 is subject to LIHEAP, are subject to the provisions of this section. The federal awarding agency must notify the public, and this section provides what that notification consists of, and the format is prescribed by GSA in terms of compliance with this section. Each of you should know what information would be published in the notification. For each program, the federal awarding agency must submit the following information to GSA: the program description, purpose, goals, and measurement, a brief summary of the statutory or regulatory requirements of the program and its intended outcome. They also must provide identification whether federal awards are on a discretionary basis or prescribed statutory basis, the projected total amount of funds available for the program, the anticipated source of available funds, the general eligibility requirements, and the applicability of single audit requirements. This is what HHS has to do, the Federal Awarding Agency requirements. I must emphasize that. This is so you know what information HHS will provide. The post-federal award requirements applicable to LIHEAP are 75.351, the subrecipient and contractor determinations, 75.352, the requirements for the pass-through entities, and 75.353, the fixed amount subawards. Section 75.351 requires the pass-through entity to make a case-by-case determination of whether the recipient of the federal awards is a subrecipient or contractor. Pass-through entity means a non-federal entity that provides a subaward to a subrecipient to carry out part of a federal program. This is defined in Section 75.2 under the definitions section. I want to repeat, a case-by-case determination must be made of whether the recipient of the federal awards is a subrecipient or a contractor. As you make this determination, remember that the entity may concurrently receive federal awards as a recipient, a subrecipient, and a contractor, depending on the substance of its agreements with federal awarding agencies and pass-through entities. A pass-through entity must make case-by-case determination whether each agreement it makes for the disbursement of federal program funds casts the party receiving the funds in the role of a subrecipient or a contractor. Use judgment in making a determination whether an agreement between a pass-through entity and another non-federal entity casts the latter as a subrecipient or a contractor. The substance of the relationship is more important than the form of the agreement. The characteristics of a subrecipient. First, a subaward is for the purpose of carrying out a portion of a federal award and creates a federal assistance relationship. The characteristics, which are listed on the slide, support the classification of the non-federal entity as a subrecipient, and they include when the entity determines who is eligible to receive what federal assistance, when they have their performance measured in relationship to whether objectives of a federal program were met, if they have the responsibility for programmatic decision-making or are responsible for adherence to applicable federal program requirements specified in the federal award, and in accordance with this agreement, uses the federal funds to carry out a program for a public purpose specified in the authorizing statute, as opposed to providing goods or services for the benefit of the pass-through entity. Again, I want to emphasize the substance of the agreement is more important than the form. One or all of the characteristics may be prevalent. Again, one of those characteristics listed, only one or all may be. For example, if you provide funds to an organization and they are responsible for eligibility requirements or their performance is measured in relation to the program objective, they are subrecipient. Any of the characteristics may be present. It does not have to be all. Contractor determinations. A contract is for the purpose of obtaining goods and services for the non-federal entity's own use and creates a procurement relationship with the contractor. Characteristics indicative of a procurement relationship between the non-federal entity and a contractor when the non-federal entity receiving the funds provides the goods and services in normal business operations, or provides the goods or services to many different purchasers, or normally operates in a competitive environment. They could provide goods or services that are ancillary to the operation of the federal program, or if they're not subject to compliance requirements of the federal program as a result of the agreement, those similar requirements may apply for other reasons. All of the characteristics listed may not be present in all cases, and the pass-through entity must use judgment in classifying each agreement as a sub-award or a procurement contract. An example of a contract may be purchase of supplies or paper or janitorial services. My note here and my recommendation to you is that you document the determination for the classification, whether it be a sub-award or a subrecipient or a contractor, that you document how you came to that determination. It would be beneficial to have that documentation in terms of your determination to support that classification. Section 75.352 requires that each subaward is clearly defined as such and includes certain information at the time of the subaward. There are 13 items required to be disclosed for federal identification purposes. The subrecipient name, the DUNS number, the federal award identification number, the date, the federal award date, the subaward period of performance, the start and end date, the amount of federal funds obligated, the total amount of federal funds obligated to the subrecipient, total amount of the federal award, the federal award project description, the name of the federal awarding agency, pass-through entity, and contact information for awarding official, the CFDA number and name, the identification of whether the award is R&D, research and development, and the indirect cost rate for the federal award, including if a de minimis rate is charged per section 75.414. There's other information that also needs to be disclosed at the time of the award per section 75.352. All requirements imposed by the pass-through entity on the subrecipient so that the federal award is used in accordance with federal statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of the federal award. Also, any additional requirements that the pass-through entity imposes on the subrecipient in order for the pass-through entity to meet its own responsibility to the federal awarding agency, including identification of any required financial and performance reports. An approved federally recognized indirect cost rate negotiated between the subrecipient and the federal government, or if no such rate exists, either a rate negotiated between the pass-through entity and the subrecipient. In compliance with this part, or a de minimis indirect cost rate, again as defined in section 75.414. A requirement that the subrecipient permit the pass-through entity and auditors to have access to the subrecipient's records and financial statements is necessary for the pass-through entity to meet the requirements of this section. And subpart F, the audit requirements. Also, appropriate terms and conditions concerning the closeout of the subaward. Section 75.352, the evaluation process. It requires for pass-through entities to evaluate each subrecipient's risk of noncompliance with federal statutes, regulations, and terms and conditions of the subaward for the purpose of determining the appropriate subrecipient monitoring. Again, an evaluation of the subrecipient's risk of noncompliance in order to determine the appropriate subrecipient monitoring. How this is done. Based on the subrecipient's prior experience with the same or similar subawards, the results of previous audits, including whether or not the subrecipient receives a single audit in accordance with subpart F, and the extent to which the same or similar subaward has been audited as a major program, whether the subrecipient has new personnel or new or substantially changed their systems, and the extent and results of federal awarding agency monitoring if the subrecipient also receives federal awards directly from a federal awarding agency. Based on this evaluation of each subrecipient's risk, consider imposing specific subaward conditions upon the subrecipient if appropriate, which is described in 75.207 and gives specific conditions. Also consider monitoring the activities of the subrecipient as necessary to ensure the subaward is used for authorized purposes in compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and terms and conditions of the subaward, and that the subaward performance goals are achieved. Section 75.352 also, depending upon the assessment of risk posed by the subrecipient, provides recommended monitoring tools that may be useful for the pass-through entity to ensure proper accountability and compliance with program requirements and achievement of program goals. The conditions that may be opposed in section 75.207 provides the following: requiring payments as reimbursements rather than advance payments, withholding authority to proceed to the next phase until receipt of evidence of acceptable performance within a given period of performance. Also, you may require additional, more detailed financial reports. You may require additional project monitoring. May require the non-federal entity to obtain technical or management assistance or establish additional prior approvals before moving to the next step. Remember, the federal awarding agency or pass-through entity must notify the applicant or non-federal entity as to the nature of the additional requirements and the reason why the additional requirements are being imposed. They must also notify them of the nature of the action needed to remove the additional requirement, the time allowed for completing the actions if applicable, and the method for requesting reconsideration of additional requirements imposed. Any special conditions must be promptly removed once the conditions that have prompted them have been corrected. Pass-through entity monitoring of the subrecipient must include, I'm going to send you back to the previous slide. Pass-through entity monitoring of the subrecipient must include reviewing financial and programmatic reports required by the pass-through entity, following up and ensuring that the subrecipient takes timely and appropriate action on all deficiencies pertaining to the federal award provided to the subrecipient detected through audits, on-site reviews, and other means. Issuing a management decision for audit findings pertaining to the federal award provided to the subrecipient from the pass-through entity as required by Section 75.521, which is management decision. Monitoring tools may be useful for the pass-through entity to ensure proper accountability and compliance with program requirements and achievement of performance goals. Providing subrecipients with training and technical assistance on program-related matters, and performing on-site reviews of subrecipients' program operations, or arranging for agreed-upon procedure engagements as described in Section 75.425. Agreed-upon procedure engagements are engagements with auditing firms to come in and perform agreed-upon procedures to review compliance or performance. They are not a full-blown audit. Section 75.352 also requires verification that every subrecipient is audited as required by Subpart F. Audit requirements of this part when it is expected that the subrecipient's federal awards expended during the respective fiscal year equal or exceed the thresholds set forth in 75.501 audit requirements. You also have to consider whether the results of the subrecipient's audits, on-site reviews, or other monitoring indicate conditions that necessitate adjustments to the pass-through entity's own records. Consider taking enforcement action against non-compliant subrecipients as described in 75.371, remedies for non-compliance. You should have a general knowledge, just a general knowledge of the single audit requirements and the remedies that are available in Section 75.371 for non-compliance. Finally, Section 75.353. Fixed amount subawards is also applicable to LAHEAP. These are subawards based on fixed amounts. With prior written approval from the federal awarding agency, a pass-through entity may provide subawards based on fixed amounts up to the simplified acquisition threshold, provided that the subawards meet the requirements for fixed awards in 75.201. Again, LAHEAP may be available for fixed amount subawards. However, you must first have approval from the awarding agency. And we'll move to the single audit requirements. Subpart F of the guidelines cover the audit requirements. As I mentioned earlier, the audit requirements are law and LIHEAP is applicable, and they are applicable to LIHEAP. The Single Audit Act was passed in 1984, has since been updated by Circulars A128 and A133, so the audit requirements are not new. What's new is the threshold. The uniform guidelines raised the single audit threshold from $500,000 in federal awards per year to $750,000 in federal awards. In terms of determination of a high-risk or low-risk auditee, based on an evaluation by the auditor, a determination is made whether the recipient is high-risk or low-risk auditee. A high-risk auditee is a recipient which has a high risk of not complying with federal laws and regulations, while a low risk is the exact opposite. For example, an auditor may judge a recipient to be high numerous for that low risk determination. And no longer does the cognizant or Next, we'll talk about major program determination. And these are important. Again, understanding if there are no auditors on the call, we're not attempting to make you auditors, but you should have some familiarity with the Single Audit Act and this subpart in terms of whether your subgrantee or subrecipient is a low risk or high risk auditee, and also in terms of major program determination. Section 75.518 deals with major program determination. The auditor must use a risk-based approach to determine which programs, which federal programs, are major programs. This risk-based approach must include consideration of current and prior audit experience, the oversight by the federal agencies and pass-through entities, and the inherent risk of the federal program. The auditor must identify the larger federal programs, which must be labeled Type A. Type A programs are defined as federal programs with federal awards expended during the audit period exceeding certain levels. The lowest threshold is $750,000. The other levels with the issuance of the new circular remain the same. They are listed, again, total federal awards expended 3% or $3 million, or total federal awards expended of 0.3%. The criteria for a high-risk Type A has changed. I won't get into detail. Again, the auditor makes the determinations, but you should be aware of whether you have a Type A program or Type B program. The auditor must identify Type B programs, which are high risk using professional judgment, and the criteria in 75.519, which is the criteria for federal program risk. There are some determinations in terms of how many Type B programs are to be identified as high risk or low risk. In 75.516, the audit findings, the auditor must report in a schedule of findings and question costs, known question costs that are greater than $25,000 for a type of compliance requirement for a major program. Known question costs are those specifically identified by the auditor. In evaluating the effect of question costs on the opinion on compliance, The auditor considers the best estimate of total question costs, which are likely question costs, not just the question costs specifically identified or known. In reporting the question costs, the auditor must include information to provide proper perspective for judging the prevalence and consequences of the question costs. Information to provide proper perspective for judging the prevalence and consequences of audit findings, such as whether the audit findings represent an isolated instance or a systematic problem. Section 75.518 also deals with the percentage of coverage rule, which again, if the auditee meets criteria for a low-risk auditee, the auditor need only audit the major programs, and such additional federal programs with federal awards expended that in aggregate encompass at least 20% of the total federal awards expended. Again, this is in section 75.518, which governs the percentage of federal programs that must be audited if it's a low-risk auditee. If they're not otherwise a low-risk auditee, the auditor must audit the programs and such additional federal programs with the federal awards expended that in aggregate, all major programs encompass at least 40% of the total federal awards expended. Section 75.512 on report submission requires publication of the single audit reports online with safeguards for protected, personally identifiable information, and an exception for Indian tribes in order to reduce the administrative burden on non-federal entities associated with transmitting these reports to all interested parties. With that, I'm probably 15 minutes ahead of time, but I think I'll turn it back over to Benita, and if there are questions, we will entertain those. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Charles. We really appreciate that, and to Lauren as well. Just as a reminder to everyone, if you would like to ask a question, you can either click the raise hand icon in your control panel, and then I can unmute your line, or you can type in your question into the control panel, and then I can call you and unmute your line from that as well. Okay? So go ahead and feel free to jump in the queue and either click the raise hand icon or type in your question. And we do have a question already. And let me just pull her up. Okay, first question comes from Melissa Coyne. Go ahead, Melissa, your line is unmuted. Melissa, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah, I was on mute. Sorry. Yeah, just a quick question. Since the cost principles don't apply to LIHEAP, like what do we do when we go out and we monitor in our agencies, we look at their expenditures and we notice that they've purchased alcohol or that they're buying promotional items or they're advertising? How do we disallow those costs?
Lauren, do you want to answer that?
Sure. So though the cost principles don't apply to LIHEAP, there is still the LIHEAP statute that lays out specifically that the federal funds are to be used for very specific purposes relating to heating assistance, cooling assistance, crisis assistance, weatherization, equipment repair, so on and so forth. There are some references to Assurance 16 activities. So something like alcohol clearly would not fall within an allowable type LIHEAP expense. When you talk about promotional materials, I would probably want to know a little more about that, because if it's materials that could be considered outreach for LIHEAP. That would be an allowable direct program expense for LIHEAP if it's actually trying to get the word out about LIHEAP. So, if you have any questions about specific costs that you're seeing that you want to kind of bounce off of us, if you think they fall within the statute, we're happy to have that conversation with you on a case-by-case basis. You can reach out to your liaison or Ekam Raman, our operations branch chief, or me, and we're happy to talk about that with you. But we don't apply the cost principles. If you, as our prime grantees, choose to implement the cost principles, you're permitted to do that. We just don't require you to do that. And for some of you who also run the Community Services Block Grant Program, you may choose to do that because you do have to use the cost principles for that program. So really, I think this will come down to a case-by-case decision on how you implement it. But certainly, as you're monitoring and you're seeing different kinds of expenses, feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to talk to you about that.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Thank you very much, Melissa, for your question. And I see a couple people have asked if we can get, if you can all get a copy of the presentation. As I noted earlier, we will post this call recording on the performance measurement website. It'll just need to give us a couple weeks to get the 508 recording. If you need the slides sooner than that, you can go ahead and reply back to either the Outlook appointment or my reminder email that I sent out last night, and I can send you a copy. But otherwise, this whole recording will be posted for all of you to access. Okay, our next question comes from Ben Moore. Go ahead, Ben. Your line is unmuted.
My question just had to do with, I think it was one of the first couple slides, talked about merit-based grants. I was just curious what that phrase meant as opposed to, the normal WAC grant, or just wanted some clarification on that. Hello?
Yes,
Hi. I think you're referring to slide 6 that Charles presented about the purpose of the reform for the Uniform Administrative Guidance, where he
right.
The different reasons behind it. Charles, do you want to go into a little more about that particular point on your slide?
Well, there are, in terms of the focus for the change, is to focus on performance of these grants, and the Uniform Administrative Guidance opens it up, or its objective is such that to measure performance, the award as we go forward, and this place for a while. I can't speak for the federal government, but my sense is you'll see now, based on the performance outcomes, awards will now be to be shifted toward how you're achieving those objectives, and thus be based on the merit of the program outcomes achieving.
Yeah, I would say that this is, again, this is our interpretation of what our Federal Office of Management and Budget has issued, so we would certainly defer to OMB on that particular clarification. But basically, as Charles is explaining, that it's getting to more of a performance management approach to federal awards. And so as the prime grantees are deciding whether or not to use SEP recipients, making sure that you're doing those risk assessments of the SEP recipients, and so that you're issuing those awards based on the results that you're seeing and holding them accountable for.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right, thanks a lot, Ben.
And actually, if I could, I'd just like to follow up on that by pointing out when Charles was discussing on slide slides 21 and 22, where he was talking about the distinction between subrecipients versus contractors. I think that the two particular points that jumped out at me on slide 21 was number 3, whether or not that subrecipient has the authority to make programmatic decision making. And on slide 22, number 5, regarding that the contractor is someone who is not subject to the compliance requirements of the federal program. And so, clearly if you are giving federal LIHEAP money to an entity that is going to be doing certain types of intake services where they are making eligibility determinations or benefit determinations, our expectation is that you are including in whatever sort of written agreement you have with that agency, whether it's a grant or a contract, a very clear reference to all of our federal LIHEAP rules, and that those expectations and rules are what they will be also held accountable to for the use of that federal LIHEAP funds. And so in our view, they would definitely be subject to the compliance requirements, and that is why when we go out on our monitoring site visits, we do, for those states that use local administering agencies, we do pick a few agencies to visit and determine as a reflection of how well the state is actually setting those expectations, doing training and monitoring of those federal expectations all the way through to the end use of the funds.
All right. Thank you very much, Lauren. Our next question comes from Christine Keel. Go ahead, Christine. Your line is unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. My question just was regarding the promotional materials. Do they have to be entity identified, or can they be just generic promotional materials that don't identify the tribe itself or the entity that's administering the promotional handouts?
Well, thanks for the question. Again, I think that term promotional is being driven from the cost principles, which don't apply to LIHEAP. For LIHEAP, you are permitted to spend direct program dollars on outreach materials for LIHEAP. And so it would have to be specific to LIHEAP. It's fine if it's a general material for your agency or your office, so long as there is some reference to LIHEAP on that material, and some, whether it's directing them to your office location or a phone number to call to find out more about LIHEAP, but there has to be some explicit connection to LIHEAP for it to be charged to the LIHEAP federal funding. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Christine. Our next question comes from Yolanda Reyna. Go ahead, Yolanda. Your line is unmuted.
Hello, this is Yolanda with the Apache Tribe, Tribal LIHEAP. My question, and I need clarification, and I may have missed it, about slide 21 and 22 about purchasing goods and services. And like if you're buying office supplies for your LIHEAP program, do you have to go through all of those requirements? Did I miss that? You know, of identifying what the characteristics and documenting.
Are you there?
Yes.
Okay. In terms of where you're at on slide 21, you're saying if you've identified it as a contractor, you're just purchasing office supplies?
Uh-huh.
Would document, or just for retention, that it is a vendor, you're only purchasing office supplies from that vendor.
And if it's only a vendor, do you have to, so would you have to get their DUNS number and all that other stuff and put regulations?
No, you would not. As if you're determined to be a contractor and you're purchasing, they're providing goods and within their normal, such as supplies, you do not have to go through that. There are requirements in terms of reporting payments to I don't want you to think you don't have to do anything, but you may need their EIN for specific. If they're, say, a janitorial service that you have to report 1099.
Yeah, we are buying those types of services. And I guess I missed it on that I-22 number 5. It is not subject to compliance requirements if it's a contractor.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, I understand now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Yolanda. And I apologize, everyone. There's some echo going on. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lauren.
Sorry, just wanted to jump in on that as well, and completely agree with Charles that if you're using someone as a contractor for the purchase of goods, as you mentioned, office supplies, then all of these different reporting requirements that are being laid out here do not apply. The reporting requirements are if you've designated the entity to be a subrecipient. For most tribes, you're not going to have subrecipients of that nature, so a lot of this won't apply to you. But many of the states do have subrecipients that actually will have intake staff who are actually working the LIHEAP applications and making those eligibility and benefit determinations, and so these additional reporting requirements would be necessary. And I guess as a side note to this, I would just mention that with respect to your energy vendors, through Assurance 8 of the LIHEAP statute, there are certain consumer safeguards that we're expecting that each of you will negotiate with your energy vendors, and that is why we strongly recommend that you have written agreements with your energy vendors to make it very clear as to what expectations you have for that working relationship in terms of if it's a crisis payment, how they're going to make a delivery, for example, if it's a crisis payment, and all these different issues. And so just as a side note, keep in mind that there is that separate Assurance 8 requirement in the LIHEAP statute regarding vendors. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for those clarifications. Our next question comes from Sharon Vineyard. Go ahead, Sharon, your line is unmuted. Sharon, you might be on mute. Okay, we'll give her another second to hop on the line. And Sharon, if you are able to come back on, just go ahead and write me a message in the question panel. Okay, our next question comes from Heather Jones. Go ahead, Heather, your line is unmuted.
Yes, I have a question about subrecipients or subgrantees that we contract that do not have federally negotiated indirect rates. I understand when we contract with our subrecipients, we give them a portion for direct services for crisis, to alleviate crisis and pay the utility companies. And we also give them administrative funds for their staffing and admin of the program. And included in that is an indirect that they determine for their administrative salaries, such as executive directors and fiscal and personnel and people like that. And they base that indirect federal amount on their salary and fringe they pay the people who are making the benefit and determination of eligibility. But if you have an agency that does not have a federally negotiated indirect rate, I understand that the new guidance is that they can either determine one with the grantee or the state, or we go with a 10% amount. Is that 10% amount based on the admin that we contract with them? And is that the total admin amount we contract with them? Or is it the total amount of the contract, including the direct service?
Hi, Heather. This is Lauren. I'll jump in on that one. So it would not be 10% of the total contract. It would be, as we normally treat indirect costs, that it's charged to your admin budget for that agency. So if you're setting aside up to, say, the 10% maximum for admin costs for that agency that the LIHEAP statute allows, you might have, say, 3 different local agencies that you have as subrecipients. Maybe one has a federally negotiated rate of 22% for indirect costs. So they are charging 22% of that 10% that you've awarded them for admin costs from LIHEAP. You might have another agency that you work out a specific rate of whatever it might be, again, maybe 15%. 15% is charged to that admin line item that you've negotiated in their contract. Or you just could go with a de minimis 10%, which again would be 10% charged to that admin line item in that contract you have with that, or grant agreement you have with that subrecipient. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So, Lauren, let me ask a follow-up question. For example, in our contract, I'm just going to use a basic situation where we give them $100,000 for direct services to provide for crisis, and we give them $10,000 for administrating that $100,000. Of that $10,000, they could use 10% of it if they didn't have an indirect rate worked out for their indirect cost. Is that correct?
So let me just repeat. You said the question is that if there is no federally recognized indirect cost rate or a separate agreement with them, between them and you, your agency, then they can just charge up to 10% for the of their admin line item.
Right.
Yes. That's
okay,
correct.
Because what we don't do is when we do the 10% on the total grant, is we give our agencies 8% of that. We retain 2% at the state level, but of that 8% we allocate it among the agencies. But we actually give them a line item of what they can use for admin to administer their program.
Right, that's fine, because again, the 10% cap for LIHEAP admin is looked at on a statewide or a tribal-wide basis. So if you're a state that is deciding, well, you know, you don't necessarily want to just pass through 10% of each amount to each of your local agencies, but you want to give them a certain dollar amount, and so maybe that works out to different percentages for different agencies. As long as all of that plus your statewide LIHEAP admin are within your 10% of your total LIHEAP grant, you're in good shape.
Okay. The fear I have is that if we allow the agency, I'm sorry to take up so much time, but if we allow the agency to take the entire 10% of the entire grant we give them for indirect, then they don't have to have any staff processing applications.
Well, part of this comes also down to how you define administrative costs for LIHEAP, because the LIHEAP statute and regulations don't define that for you, and that's one of the questions that we'll ask when we come out on a monitoring site visit is, how are you defining admin costs? And so you can choose to break up a portion of the salary and benefits for different staff based on the type of work that they're doing. And so if they're doing, a part of their time is doing outreach, outreach can be considered a non-admin cost charged to your direct program line item. So a portion of their salaries could be charged to that for outreach. Similarly, if you're doing Assurance 16 activities relating to energy efficiency education or budget coaching, the portion of the salaries spent towards those activities could be charged to those separate line items rather than your admin budget. Similarly, if you want to break up the case management work that caseworkers are doing through intake, portion of those salaries can be charged to non-admin. So there is some flexibility there in terms of, but I hear your concern, Heather, that a straight 10% all for indirect doesn't leave flexibility for other types of admin costs.
Yeah, I'm just concerned if it's 10% of the entire grant award that we give them, that if you have them paying their executive salaries out of that, I'm not sure there'll be enough staff to process applications.
Right, and our understanding is not that it is not 10% off of the total award.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Heather. Our next question comes from Christina Davis. Go ahead, Christina, your line is unmuted.
Basically, I had the same type of question that Heather did of how the 10% worked with the admin cap.
Okay, great. Well, did we
So I think that you answered it.
Okay. Well, we are planning to issue an updated information memorandum relating to administrative costs. The last one we issued was probably close to 15 years ago. So we're going to update that and send that out soon. And this will be one of the clarifications that we put in there as well. And in the meantime, if you have specific questions, then feel free to reach out to one of us in our office.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we have a hand raised from Jean Amison. Go ahead, Jean, your line is unmuted.
Yes, hi, can you hear me? Okay,
yes.
I hear the echo, I apologize. Going back to the indirect rate really quick, I wanted to make sure that I understood we're good with whether they use, if they have a cognizant agency, they use that rate. If they want to use indirect cost rate and they don't have a negotiated rate, they use the 10%. Or I am under the impression they can, which is what most of our agencies do, direct charge to LIHEAP and do not use indirect costs in that grant. So that is still allowed, is it not?
Yes, as long as, again, that's not going to exceed your cap for LIHEAP administrative cost expenses.
Right. No, we give them 8.5% for admin and then some additional dollars or percentage for programmatic and outreach costs. So between the two. But most of the agencies that don't have a negotiated rate, they just direct charge. So if they spend 50% of their time, they charge 50% of their salary, and they keep, cars and whatnot. So that's how they've been doing it historically, and I just wanted to make sure I understood the new circular language correctly so that we can continue that.
So they are doing that based off of the timekeeping records that they keep for the staff doing those types of activities?
Yes,
okay,
we do. We check them, and we monitor them, and they give us a cost allocation plan for how they're going to do that, how they direct charge.
Okay. Yeah, as long as you have that backup documentation on hand, I would think that's sufficient. Charles, do you have any clarification or comment on that?
I would say that is correct, that as long as they're documenting that, you don't have to, all they're doing is charging direct and not charging overhead rate. And so would be fine. That would allow.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jean. And I do apologize that we're having some audio issues today with the echo. I'm really sorry about that. One of the questions that we received from one of the participants, I'm going to try again. Sharon, are you on the line now? Sharon Vineyard? You might be on mute on your end.
Yes, I'm here.
Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I'm not asking the question, but I have a guest with me. Her name's Linda, and she's going to ask the question.
Okay, so what I'm wondering about is the monitoring and what is expected of the monitoring of lower tier organizations. And what I'm speaking of there is where the prime awardee has a subrecipient and that subrecipient also has subrecipients. What's the responsibility of the prime awardee to directly monitor those lower tier organizations? And what sort of activities would you expect this would involve?
Could you repeat the last part of that question?
As far as the responsibility for what's the responsibility of the prime awardee to directly monitor the lower tiers? And in other words, the prime awardee would have a subrecipient, but the subrecipient has also subawarded. What's the responsibility for monitoring duties for the prime awardee for those lower tier organizations?
Okay, thanks for the question. I think I understand now. So there may be, again, this sounds more of a state issue than a tribal issue, but say you have a state where you have subrecipients that you grant or contract to that are doing eligibility determinations, and then one or more of those local agencies further subgrants or subcontracts to other entities. We've seen this in a few very large counties, for example, where they need to break up the work further. And so the minimum expectation we would have is that the prime grantee, when you're monitoring your subrecipients, would be looking at the monitoring that your subrecipients are doing for those second-level subrecipients. And so you'd be looking at what sort of monitoring schedule they have for those second-tier subrecipients. You'd be looking at the actual monitoring tools that they're using when they go out to those second-tier subrecipients. You would be looking at the results of those monitoring efforts, any audit findings relating to those second-tier subrecipients. We'd probably encourage you to look at the process that we use when we monitor LIHEAP from the federal level, which I was describing briefly earlier, where if we go to a state that is using subrecipients, we will pick a sample of those subrecipients to visit and to look at the monitoring reports of our grantee of that state regarding those subrecipients to, again, determine how well the state, who's our prime subrecipient, is setting expectations, training, and monitoring those subrecipients. So those same responsibilities we would be holding every state accountable for all the way down the chain. So do you have to personally go out to every second-tier subrecipient? No, but we would be expecting that you're going to those prime subrecipients and inquiring regarding those second-tier subrecipients and hopefully choosing a sample of them to review in more depth. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, and that gets us through all of the questions. So I want to thank everybody for joining our webinar today. Again, I apologize for any of the audio issues that we've had. Thank you to Charles and Lauren for presenting. Really appreciate all the great information. My email address is on the screen. If you have any follow-up questions, go ahead and shoot them over, and I will get you a response as soon as possible. So with that, we're going to close the webinar, and thank you again for joining.